Hello, once again. My name is Brian, and we are back here with the Two Friends Film Podcast. Today we have again Fowler. Say hello.
It's great to be back.
Perfect. And we watched Network. Network is a 1975 film. It the To start off, I'll give a brief synopsis. So essentially, the film is about a network, a TV network that is trying to stay afloat, financially speaking, and in order to do so, they have to make some business decisions that essentially compromise their news network to become more oriented towards uh, essentially a profit motive over a narrative structure motive. Now, this was Fowler's pick for a film. I'm going to turn it over to him to talk a little bit about the things why specifically he thought this would be a great one for us to sit down and watch today.
So Network is an interesting film. It's a black comedy kind of satire film, and in a sense, um, Network was supposed to be quite outrageous, but a lot of the things that Network does that are satirical, that are over the top, that are supposed to be kind of like embellishments of where news could go, and they end up actually happening. Like if you watch the movie, and Brian and I can talk about this a little bit, like part of it does not read in a modern context as like a black comedy. Like you watch it and it feels more like a drama because a lot of the insane in their time decisions that the network ends up making, um we do them today. They are common practice in cable television.
Yeah, and it's one of those films that I think things age really well for it, right? The profit motive in terms of network television is a very prescient thing with a lot of news media outlets. But I think what's really interesting is how that model has also changed because we actually live in a more streaming um, oriented type of mass media. So, for example, uh, we
Well, we might want to summarize really quickly. So
Oh,
the
sure.
the the black comedy nature of it is network is basically set at the beginning of the mass media and the rise of television. And as Brian was talking about, it's sort of the beginning of the corporatization of media, media being for profit, media being influenced by, um, you know, the number of eyeballs in it rather than being informative. And there's a lot of complicated political reasons why media went from being mainly concerned with being informative and unbiased to being kind of a profit motive. But the crux of network, the comedy of it is this big cable television network. In basically, one of their hosts is very clearly having a mental breakdown. He's um, he's Beale. His name is Beale. Beale is definitely crazy. He hears voices. He thinks he's some sort of religious icon, and he has like a lot of conspiratorial thinking and delusions. But he does quite well on air, kind of being crazy, threatening to kill himself. And the network, because it's profitable, they encourage Beale's mental deterioration, and they give him more and more control, and they put more and more eyes on it, and it's sort of the beginning of them shifting. They also create kind of a television program where they follow around like a terrorist cell, basically a bunch of communists, and kind of follow their exploits. Um, they put like seers and all sorts of crazy people on television, and it's kind of this absurd what would happen if news was truly motivated just by profit and they stopped caring about everything else. And then obviously everything falls apart. They can't control Beale and a lot of the other kind of insane demagogic forces that they put on television. And, they're pumping out all this propaganda that's making people desperate and afraid. And that starts to affect American society in a negative way. And in the end, um, Beale is killed by the network, both to stop him from kind of rampaging and saying whatever he wants, and also as a means to save their ratings. And yeah, it's a very interesting film. Obviously, killing a news anchor is kind of wild today, but I would say like a lot of elements of network are really what happens today. I mean, corporate greed controlling the news and it not really being useful news is the default position in the modern day. The fact that many, journalists and pundits and now politicians are demagogues, and they're propped up by the media because um, they're provocative and they're good at getting money and attention, is a thing today. I mean, I think in a sense, reality has been even crazier than what network predicted, because it would be like, instead of watching Howard Beale and using him to learn about like the world, we kind of lived through the era where like Howard Beale is the fucking president. I think the kind of pandering to the lowest common denominator is something that really happens now. And a lot of the over the top people that in network are put on television, they are basically just genres that already exist. Like the whole following around the communist terrorist cell. I mean, that's just true crime in modern reality television. Beale kind of being this insane demagogic force, and he's just completely unhinged, and he's kind of crazy and angry and anti-establishment, and he gets a lot of attention because people are angry and dissatisfied. I mean, look at Fox News, look at so many places where that is the business model. You're putting kind of insane people out who say unhinged things, and it's a way of kind of making money. And then I think overall, I mean, network kind of talks at the end about how like the television network's choice of putting all of these kind of insane, angry, counterculture people on the news, like it has an effect on the populace. It makes the populace angry. There's a part of the film where essentially it's the beginning of a riot. And I think we can see today how, those same conditions of corporate greed and the profit motive propping up all of these kind of demagogic figures has also created an increasingly polarized, desperate, and angry public who do think the world is ending because we've put all these people on the television and in public office who tell them every day that it is.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting is I can't really speak as much on sort of I can speak on some themes, but this is more Fowler's wheelhouse in terms of talking about the political implications of a film like this. But I think it's really telling too for a film of 75 at that point to really hone in on corporate sort of corruption as well as the profit motive. And like you said, it's really telling how a film that was satirical in nature uh, came to be sort of more of a drama because of the reality. And we talked about this while watching it, really. I think another thing I'd like to really point to as well, just from an artistic perspective, is I really enjoyed some of the imagery, some of the cinematography, the acting, writing. There were phenomenal lines of dialogue. You know,
The acting in this film is phenomenal. I think it's, I mean, I think it's, I think the guy who played Beale got an actor for Best Actor.
mhm,
I think the wife of Max, one of the television journalists, I think his wife got an Oscar.
mhm.
I think kind of the main villain of it, the executive producer who pushes a lot of these changes, I think she got an Oscar, and I think it's well deserved. It's a fantastically acted film.
Yeah, and like I wanted to point out actually one of the scenes that we talked about a little bit that struck me was that ending sort of dialogue with the two main like the main reporter as well as what's his name, the Jenkins or Jensen,
Jensen, the leader of the cable television, the CEO guy.
yeah. Um, yeah, that scene where he's in the office preaching like a sermon to him, essentially, and sort of feeding into his delusion to get him to do what he wants. is really
Beale, you mean? He's talking to Beale
he's
and
talking to
making him
Beale, yeah, yeah, and it's this crazy scene where it's basically shot on like a long sort of shot, showing the CEO, basically showing him like being small in the like right hand corner essentially, but having all these lights showcased on him, almost like he's in the spotlight on a stage. Uh, and when he comes closer to Beale, you can see that he's like shrouded in shadow, and then eventually a backlight is shooting on off of him, showcasing like a shadowy figure hovering over Beale. And it's really interesting how it was shot to like feed into that, you know, delusion and craziness that is going through Beale.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of elements of this film that are very ambiguous. Like, there is a lot of Christ imagery with Beale when he's kind of doing his rants on set. Um, it's obviously you'd know more about the cinematography. I thought a very interesting component of it was kind of the atmosphere of Network, where Network kind of does the same similar things to Arrival, where the news is constantly playing in the background, and it's
Mm,
Watergate, it's Vietnam, it's Nixon resigning, it's inflation, oil uncertainty, the recession, all these wars, government overreach, business corruption, and there's really a sense in the film that the reason the network is um doing a lot of this insane stuff and basically putting this insane demagogue as their main news guy, but a lot of what allows them to get away with everything for so long is just mass cynicism. People don't trust the government, people don't trust each other, people are just so disconnected, and there's a lot of points, especially in the middle and early part of the film, where there is a point where the public could step in and they don't. There's all these points where when Beale is threatening to kill himself, the news station, the people in it just don't care. They ignore him. The when Beale later he's like running around in the public and he's saying he's a prophet and saying a lot of crazy things, and the security guards and the police and the bystanders, they just kind of laugh.
yeah,
And
and actually, I wanted to point to like the part where he talks about killing himself, right? Like at first, they're all conversing in the like you know, green room, right? Or the what do you call it? Regardless, they're conversing while watching the monitors and everything like that. And then the only person to chime up was one of the writers, and she was like, "Hey, he just said he's going to kill himself," which is an insane thing that like there's like this constant disconnection between like people actually giving a shit about anyone in this film, really.
yeah, it's you get the sense that the reason everything is going off the rails is because modern American society, everyone is just so turned off. Like so much controversy and so many bad things are happening that people are just sort of clustered around their televisions or just spending times with their family, and they're not really trying to like control or perceive or moralize the world in any meaningful way. Network is very much it's a descent into madness that's largely propped up by apathy. There's so many forces within Network that could have stopped Beale being promoted to being the top anchor, stopped Beale from saying a lot of insane things, stopped the company from basically making Beale more and more crazy in order to generate more eyeballs. And people just don't because they don't care. I think there's a really telling part at the kind of the early part of the film where Max Schumacher, who's like, I guess he's in charge of the news division of the company. He's talking to another journalist, and they're talking about revolutionary groups because they're trying to cover them, radical revolutionary groups. And there's kind of a joke about how they can't even keep up. They can't even tell these criminal terrorist organizations apart because there's so many of them and they're doing so much violence that it's pointless. And I think also the the reason Beale's demagogic rants, his counter culture, anti-establishment raging, the reason why it's so surprising to so many people in the film that he's as successful as he is and so many people want to watch him is that disconnection. Not only is cynicism what allows kind of the madhouse to take power, but also that disconnection from everything else is why so many people don't realize how angry the public is and how susceptible they are to people like Beale, kind of using television as a means of radicalizing them.
Yeah, and it's very interesting because there's even a part like towards the end where Beale is basically saying like, "Hey, like only 3% of you read, and only like 13% of you read a newspaper." You know, and he's talking about how a lot of information is just gotten via the news, and a lot of it's rambling, right? Conspiratorial rambling. But there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, statistically speaking, even now, news outlets, what did you say? It was like news media is set up at a certain reading level or a certain
A fifth
level.
grade reading level.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because that is what is able to be easily obtained to the masses, like here in the States at least. Um, so it's quite interesting to, I guess, from my own perspective, as someone who is, has some political understanding, but not nearly the amount that my friend here, Fowler, does. Um, to watch this as more of a artist and look at it from an artistic perspective and say, holy shit, like, what a crazy film to create, and also a crazy film to be able to predict some of the things we see in the future, right? Um,
Yeah, it's unbelievable how much of what the film was satirizing and embellishing ended up being just the news, you know? I mean, the whole idea of Beale being on cable television while being an insane demagogue. I mean, Tucker Carlson was the top news anchor for years, and he is a white nationalist. He is a conspiracy theorist. He is crazy, and he is not alone. There are so many of them. Um,
yeah,
and I think this ties a little bit to Arrival because another theme of Network is kind of the lack of a common reality. Like, not only is the public able, their reality is able to be shifted massively by figures like Beale. Like they can use television to convince people that the world is ending, or all these sort of conspiracy theories. But also, I think there's kind of a theme in the film of all of the main characters largely being driven by ideology, and their ideology blinding them to reality. Beale, the kind of the demagogue television host, like he's kind of controlled by populism for most of the story, and he kind of lives in his own reality. Diane, who's kind of the executive producer who puts Beale on air and also encourages him to go crazy, I would say she's kind of the antagonist. She's often talked about other characters how she's insane. She just perceives everything in terms of television and mass media. She doesn't understand reality. Everything to her is kind of polarized television narratives. And then Jensen, as Brian was talking about earlier, the CEO, he is obsessed with globalization, and it's kind of a film. There isn't a kind of an endpoint where everyone understands each other like Arrival, but it is a film where everyone lives in their own reality, in a sense, and the mass media of television that they control to different extents allows them to project their own subjective reality into other people's minds.
and I think like another thing I want to talk about is like what a wild thing, because we talked about at one point the actress who plays Diane. Uh, she talks about how there are two civil wars. The CIA is tapping. Who is it? Hoover or
Humphrey, Hubert Humphrey.
Hubert Humphrey? Yes, yeah. And she then proceeds to be like, yeah, but we need to have like this crazy person on television because this is what's going to put us like in the numbers. Uh, which is just wild and speaks to the like at that time like that would be viewed as crazy, right? Like you wouldn't use a news network as an entertainment platform, but now here we sit in 2024 and you have multiple news networks that do that actively.
Yeah, definitely. There's definitely a theme of the film of all of these old values that keep the system in check are broken. Like, kind of at the early point of the film, they talk about all the journalist layoffs and how, like, at one point, being a company man and having seniority gave you protection for your job, and that doesn't matter to the industry. They allow terrorists and demagogues onto the air for ratings when there were ethical journalistic reasons you wouldn't do that. They don't focus on the news that matters, kind of like what Brian was talking about, over sensationalism, because like being a journalist is no longer important. Being crass, being wrong, being conspiratorial, and then ultimately at the end of the film, I mean, killing Beale for the ratings. It's sort of um, it's the end of the old world because all of the kind of new hungry people like Diane or Jensen, they don't care about any of the things that made society and the news business stable. All they care about is themselves and money, and so everything kind of goes off the wheels, so to speak.
So this may be a bit of an odd question, but I remember like reading a bit about like Hunter S. Thompson, like Gonzo journalism, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I was really curious about your take on this because you're more in this realm than I am. Um, so as I was watching the film, I was thinking about how Gonzo journalism basically inserted yourself into the story, right? So do you think like it at all played a part in terms of forming or creating like a story like Network?
I think they were more focused on the kind of establishment media rather than kind of experimental
Hmm.
journalism. I would say a critique I have about the film historically is the film very much sets up this dichotomy of like the new sort of television news being kind of evil and bad, and the kind of old school golden age of television, early television like newspaper guys being the good guys and them being the ethical ones. And I don't know how accurate that is. I mean, if you really study journalism at all, I mean, um, the first journalists were also the first ones to lie, to slander each other, to spread conspiracies and misinformation.
Well, to be
Seriously, in the 1930s, the top radio news guy, Father Coughlin, was like an open fascist who basically talked about the Jewish question every week.
mm, and to be fair, if it's written, it's libel. I learned that from my boy Jane Jonah Jameson. Uh, but um, no, but in all seriousness, like I feel like a lot of times when because for me, like a lot of what I watch is not in this vein. I think a vast majority of what I watch is either, historically artistic, significant filmmaking, and to watch this was a breath of fresh air because it's a little out of my wheelhouse, but it gives me like a perspective of like, oh shit, you can make like these deeply like political sort of pieces of media with this heavy emphasis on satire, but have all these different like themes and different like intricate parts going and still make it a very artistic film. Like I said, there's so many elements to appreciate about it, and it's really hard to I guess fit this into the 30 minutes segment, so we'll probably have to extend it a little bit longer. But yeah.
Yeah, I think the we talked about this a little bit about Arrival, about how they had to adapt the film from the novella because so much of the novella was about um, kind of linguism and
Mhm.
about like the complexities of language. And in order to make a film that people would appreciate, they had to kind of make it for the everyman, and they had to simplify it, and they had to make it understandable. And, I think there is a lot of skill that's required in kind of doing that. Jurassic Park is a product that I think does that too, where the books are way more science literate and kind of science nerdy. And then Spielberg's version obviously much more focuses on the kind of the majesty of the dinosaurs and enjoying just watching people be devoured by them. But
Yeah,
I think there is a power to being like Network and understanding that your film does require kind of a little bit more understanding and about politics and about the business, and choosing to keep that film kind of more thematically rich, more complex, more subtle, and just sort of making a piece of art that is harder to appreciate in many ways, but if you can appreciate it, is I think more rewarding.
yeah, and I think there's a bunch of different like films I've seen that are more art house level films, right? Like films that have those messages and everything like that, but they're more geared towards the art crowd rather than the political crowd, right? But I think there's something to be said about a film like this that really has an ability to like be timeless in a way. Like, yes, you can tell that like from the outfits, from the decor, from the way people speak, it's very much of that ilk of filmmaking, right? Like that 70s style of filmmaking. But at the same token, like we've talked about a couple times here, the themes, the way like things are presented within the films, those are timeless sort of effects, and things that have been still persistent throughout, our modern sort of context here.
I think also one of the things the film does really well is the things it chooses to satirize are very timeless. And so I think that's another thing that's allowed it to age well. It's not only was it very intelligent in predicting a lot of things that happen in the future and understanding trends, but like a lot of the things that it predicts, I think make it work a lot better. Like um, the idea of the profit motive consuming everything, I think is like a theme that's just going to exist as long as there's capitalism. And I think that makes the film really timeless. I think the idea of sort of unreality and people all living there in their own worlds and how subjective they are and how different they are, I think that's timeless in any civilization. And then also the idea of demagoguery, the idea of these people, whether for profit or because they're ideologues, who sort of articulate people's rage and paint themselves as countercultural and sort of paint the world as being apocalyptic. I think that's also a very timeless thing that's always existed in democracy. So I think that's another thing that's really allowed it to age super well. Um, One of the things that I think is really interesting about the film that is because we talked earlier about the parts that Brian and I think like it's pretty empirical that Network is correct. The things that they predict happened. But I think one of the more debatable ideas that Network has is there's kind of a theme of the mass media because Network is kind of like exploring the early mass media. And, you know, a theme of the network is that everyone in Network, the profit seeking media guys who want to make money, the business owners, um, like Jensen, who want to push like pro corporate propaganda, the demagogues, and the kind of radical extremists like Beale and the terror cells. Like everyone involved is attempting to wield the mass media to achieve their goals, but all of them are kind of distorted and corrupted by it nonetheless. The terrorists start trying to push communism, but by the end of the film, I mean, they're basically just concerned with money. It's all about the views for them. They've kind of been converted. The kind of um, the corporate people, they have to cozy up with all of these kind of maniacs and demagogues, and it changes them too. It makes them more violent, they later end up using those terrorists to kill Beale in order to achieve their goals. Jensen and Beale both try and kind of shift the ideology of the company. Beale trying to push it more populist, Jensen trying to push it to be more corporate, trying to make Beale sort of buy his kind of pro globalization, pro corporate idea. And I think that's a lot more debatable about who really is in charge in network, who really is in charge of the mass media, because everything kind of collapses and nobody really ends the film being in a better place than when they started. I mean, Beale dies, the communists are kind of absorbed into the company becomes increasingly violent and terroristic in order to keep getting ratings, and it's kind of implied heavily the FBI is looking into them and they're going to get sued, so they might collapse. It's just kind of a mess.
And I think what really wraps it all up in its little bow about sort of the critique of corporatization and the mass media, right, is that at the very end, when Beale is shot and killed, what are we shown? The four screens showcasing different news networks covering it, interspliced with ads, right? Like, it's really to hammer home at the very end that, like, even amongst mass, like, this insane tragedy, they still need to make a buck from it.
Mm-hmm. That's definitely true. I mean, I would say there's kind of a battle in the film of, because definitely the corporate guys are the ones that are profit motivated, and Jensen is profit motivated, and the executive producer kind of villain character Diane, she's motivated by profit. But I would argue that some of the other people who are attempting to control the mass media are not profit motivated. Like Beale is not motivated by profit. He's kind of like a religious fanatic. The communists are not, at least most of them, motivated by profit. And I don't know. It's a kind of an interesting film because everything goes off the rails and more insane things happen, but everyone is just clinging to the television because they think in the end they're going to win the power struggle, and just the ultimate power of the mass media will allow them to achieve their goals.
You know what's actually a very similar film, at least in theme, and I put this on my list. You've never seen The Truman Show, right?
I haven't, no.
Yeah, The Truman Show actually deals a lot with the mass media, not from a news network sort of perspective, but rather like showcasing like from a TV show perspective, which is actually pretty interesting, sort of to that conversation about consumerism and capitalism as well. But that's something we'll talk about when we get there eventually when we watch together. Um, here's a question for you. I know this isn't your first time watching the film. What is something you appreciate about watching this like again that you didn't originally appreciate the first go through?
For me, I didn't realize. So when I first watched the film, I think I viewed it more as like a more straightforward film about like the profit motive corrupting everything, which I think is definitely true in the beginning part of the film. But I think there's kind of, at the end of the film, it kind of seems almost like the mass media itself is corruptive, like even outside of the profit motive, that just having that many eyeballs at a time, having the ability to produce that much money and attention, that in itself is corrupting. And I think one of the things that I didn't notice initially was that kind of makes an argument that the mass media itself is corrupting, not just the profit motive, is that a lot of the characters in the film who are supposed to be the old school journalists, they allow kind of Beale to take power and go on the news, and they allow Diane and the corporate guys and Jensen to achieve their goals because they are also enamored by the mass media and its power. And I don't know, I find that very interesting. Where I think initially I viewed it more as kind of an anti-capitalism, anti-corporatism film. And the more and more I watch it, I kind of see it as more of a uh, kind of a like a warning film about just the media itself, television itself, the internet itself.
I think it's very interesting too, because at one point we talked about the attention economy, right?
Mhm.
And we talked about how this film kind of predicts that attention economy. No, it doesn't outright like predict things like social media or things like that, but it predicts that the way to get viewership, and the way to get it is by going to those extremes, right? And by catering to a type of individual that will be able to keep like their eyes glued on the screen, right? Whether that be, in this case, now our smartphones, but in their case, like the television screen, right? And I think it's very telling that, again, this film predicted such a fundamental aspect of our lives now, in 75, which is like, what, essentially almost 60 years ago now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think this goes back to the corruption element of the mass media is that a big theme of the film, which is definitely true now, is the mass media is so powerful that you bend over backwards in order to accommodate it and get on it. Like one of the funnier parts of the film is there's this point where the terrorists, the communist terrorists, who they're filming and making the show about, they're like sitting around looking at scripts because they're trying to basically make sure that their terrorist attacks are like viable on television and that they'll look good and they'll be dynamic and they'll get views. And that's that's not a fiction. I mean, if you think about like ISIS or like white nationalist attacks in America, filming your terror attacks is standard operating procedure in most of the West. And being obsessed with the way that you will be perceived in the media is just a facet of politics and even terrorist politics.
I mean, yeah, you look at it with any sort of like manifesto from, your sort of right wing, sort of a shooter or anything like that, and you do see that, like, they are engaged in sort of understanding that, hey, the news cycle moves fast, so I need to capitalize as much as I can right now, which is a crazy thing to do. But
Mm.
again, this film showcases, like you said, via violence, they are capitalizing as much as they can. They they shot and assassinated. Um, oh, I don't know why I'm blanking on his name again.
Yeah.
Beale, yeah, they shot and assassinated Beale on television because they knew it would be profitable for their organization, which is just an insane thing to say, but like that is their only goal in that sense.
Another thing that makes the film interesting from a meta commentary, because I've read analysis of it and things like that, and Network. I don't know if Network is really well known by the average person, but Network is definitely like a cult following among like news political people. Is Network is kind of an interesting Rorschach test where it's perceived in some cases in a very celebratory light, and in other ways a very tragic light. And I think this is tied most with Beale and Diane. Beale being the kind of crazy news host who's losing his mind, and Diane being the executive producer who kind of orchestrates everything. You know, there are people, politicians, media figures, and essayists who perceive Beale as a hero who's speaking for the anger of the working man and bringing truth to television. Very very prominent people. Cenk Uygur, who's the CEO of the Young Turks, which is one of the largest online sort of news shows, has done this. There have been multiple politicians who've tied themselves to Beale. I think it was Walter Cronkite perceived Beale in a very positive way, which is interesting because Beale is also perceived equally by other people as a demagogue, as someone who is losing his mind, who is clearly insane, who doesn't have anything of real value to say. And if he is, articulating rage, it is an insane conspiratorial rage that doesn't lead to anything. And Diane, the executive producer, is very similar, where some people perceive Diane as the monster who pushes Beale over the edge. She's the embodiment of corporate greed and kind of short-term gains destroying company. But other people perceive Diane as like an innovator, as someone who makes television dynamic and sexy and allows it to be perceived and understood by the average person. And a lot of the things Diane advocates for as like kind of novel techniques that have made the news better. So I think that's an interesting thing to talk about, how, depending on your politics and depending on how you view the world, seeing network as kind of like a don't fucking do this sort of tragic tale, or as a like, yeah, we should keep doing this. We should have a Howard Beale. We should have a Diane in real life.
Yeah, and like I said, it's very interesting to, I guess, see this for the first time and really not be, like I said, as much of a political person, but to also like hear you talk about like the different sort of facets that fascinate you during this film. And I think it was really a nice little touch for you to recommend something like this because it was very um, like I said before, something I had never really experienced in terms of the filmmaking sort of process. I guess now let's turn to are there bigger other themes you want to talk about? I know we've talked about capital critiques of capitalism and corporatization. What else would you want to hit on as well?
Well, I don't know if it was as intentional, but for as a modern viewer, one of the things that I think Network also talks about is mental illness. The fact that, like, in kind of a modern, disconnected, cynical society, there's really nobody in Network who is quite sane. Beale is like, he hears voices, he has delusions, he's not really there mentally. He literally has episodes where he collapses. Diane, the executive producer, she's also often referred to in the film as kind of not being tied to reality and having some brand of madness. And yeah, in a sense, like, Network is like the thing that drives Network outside of kind of these bigger systemic forces like profit or the mass media. It is also kind of a story of deeply unwell people in an uncaring society, making society more uncaring and making society more disconnected. And it kind of creates a cyclical cycle of more and more people kind of driven to madness, who in turn drive more people to madness.
Yeah, and I will say on the mental health front too, it's quite interesting. I know at the time like our mental health resources uh were not vast in 1975, but also even now like I feel like in a modern context, a Blair-like figure would not still get the resources they desperately would need, right? And that's it's insane how many things really hit and critique not only society of the time but society now, like how it is.
Yeah, thematically, Network is definitely one of the most ambitious films I've ever seen.
Yeah,
It really is a film that tries to take on an enormous amount of ideas. And I would say, compared to Arrival, I think it succeeds significantly more than Arrival did.
I would tend to agree with that. Yeah. So I would say I have to start getting going here to do some sort of things around. But are there any final critiques, thoughts, things you want to like sort of hammer home about this film?
I think the way we should end this episode is, since we started with what Network got right, what would you say Network got wrong? What things did it predict, or what things did it think were going to win out in the end that, in a modern sense, we know it didn't?
Interesting. Um, I guess I would have to kind of think about that. Like, do you have anything in particular you're thinking about right now, or?
Yeah, I think so. I think there are two things. One is in Network, the kind of demagogues and radicals are perceived as being insane. Beale is not like, someone with a real coherent ideology. He's just a very angry schizophrenic who doesn't realize that his brain is dying.
Mhm,
And I don't think that's true. I think if we look at a lot of the demagogues of our own time, Tucker Carlson being a great example, or like a lot of the Fox hosts,
mhm.
they're not insane. They're fully sane. Then they have a coherent ideology that they're pushing for. And I think kind of that's a thing that Network kind of predicted wrong, is kind of the outside forces. They may appear insane, they may say and do a lot of insane things, but I think we have kind of seen that they are often, sadly, fully rational and
Y-
in control and aware of what they're doing.
You definitely do have exceptions to that rule, like someone like Alex Jones, though, right?
Yeah, but I think he's definitely the exception to the rule.
Okay. And what was the second thing you were thinking?
I think so. This is kind of, I think when we were watching it, I told you this was kind of, for me, something that I thought was kind of controversial, which is um, Beale kind of being co-opted by the corporate environment, where Jansen, the kind of CEO of the cable company, he invites Beale to his office and he basically convinces him to be kind of like a corporate establishment stooge and to go on his show and kind of like shill for globalization and the company. I think honestly the opposite happened. I think the demagogues, instead of being co-opted by the corporate people, I think it went the other way around. They are the ones who took power. Where I think you can see this with like the Republican Party, of Donald Trump becoming president, and a lot of those conspiracy theorists and kind of maniacs kind of being the ones who actually run the party. But I think you can even see this on the news where, um, you know, they needed the anger and they needed the kind of conspiracy theories and they needed a lot of that madness in order to keep their audience. And so, even though a lot of that stuff actually isn't in the long run particularly profitable, and often it does clash with their overall ideological goals, like a lot of these news companies like Fox, like Newsmax, the demagogues are really the ones running the show.
Hmm. Yeah,
So I think those are two things that I would say Network got wrong. But overall, I mean, those are two small things in comparison to all the things it got right.
yeah. Honestly, it was hard for me to really tell what they got wrong because there were so many things that like it seemed like it was spot on in terms of its commentary. So I think for me, yes, I do tend to agree with both your points on that. Um, I think that realistically, I think there could have been different choice because there's only one scene in particular that stands out cinematography wise, and that's the ending scene with Blair and the executive, right? Um, for most of the film, it's
You mean Beetle and Jensen?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Blair and Jensen. For me, the I wish and I wish there was more playing around with dynamics in terms of like cinematography because some of those shots were very similar, and I feel like when we play around with like perspective, right? Say for example, this is another film I don't think you've seen, Cool Hand Luke.
I haven't seen that one.
Yeah. So a thing that they do to put in perspective of like the power dynamics is that the cops in the film, who are basically keeping the prisoners in line. Every time you get a shot of them, it's a upward angle towards their face to showcase almost like they are a giant standing over you, right? So I think
Hmm.
if you did something like that to showcase like where the power dynamics were in the room and stuff like that. Uh, I think that would be also a very interesting thing. Although, maybe not. Maybe having more of this subtle sort of work makes it a more, uh, you know, a better product. Uh, Another thing I was thinking about too was,
Well, really quick on that, I
yeah,
would
sure.
say I think the reason they did this, and I'm mixed as well. We've talked about how network is very understated for a satire,
Yeah.
but a lot of network is about the artificialness of creating myths, right? Like we're
Hmm.
looking kind of inside the newsroom and we're seeing how Beale is kind of created, his persona and the things he says, and all of that stuff is like calculated and calibrated by an audience. And I think part of the understated nature of it was like a lot of those kind of cinema techniques you're talking about are kind of like creating a natural narrative in the film.
Hmm.
And one of the arguments of the film kind of is that a lot of those narratives are they're not real. They're created by the mass media in order to push ideologies or make more money. So I think it's hard. I think it's hard to be dynamic as a storyteller in a film that is largely about how those dynamic storytelling techniques are manipulative and are deliberate and are very much created by unseen people with agendas.
Yeah, and I guess that could be also why that one scene sticking out is so powerful, right? Is because
Mhm.
that's kind of the one scene in the film where it is very dynamic. Like, instead of this, like, sort of static, cookie cutter sort of shots and everything. But, yeah, that's pretty much everything I have. Is there anything else you want to discuss before we sign off here?
I would just say I agree. I think if they had made Beale being on air
Hmm.
more dynamic in the way that his meeting of Jansen was,
Yeah.
maybe that would have made the film better. But also, I mean, in spite of Beale's very clear mental instability, a lot of people do worship him and perceive him as the hero of the story. So
Yeah.
maybe using those techniques would make Beale's madness less apparent to the audience.
Yeah. That could also be a thing. It's very hard to, like, interpret what the audience will get out of your film. Uh,
Mm.
so yeah, but overall, I really enjoyed it. So thank you for recommending that as well. Um, yeah, but that's our episode for today. Thank you guys for listening. And we're looking forward to bringing you more film content coming here soon. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you very much.